Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be focusing on some ideological movements that sweep across the colonies, really in the 1700s. So we're kind of progressing a little bit. It's the later colonial period. And we're going to be focusing on one big religious movement and one big intellectual movement that takes place. So the religious movement that we're going to start with is something known as the Great Awakening. Now, you guys are a lot more familiar with the Great Awakening than you probably realize. The Great Awakening is a major kind of religious fervor that sweeps across the British colonial regions during the mid to early 1700s. Now, you guys, like I said, are more familiar with this than you realize. You've been exposed to the type of Christianity that's going to become popular during the Great Awakening, which is known as evangelicalism. So, if you ever watch TV on like a Sunday morning, you probably come across these guys, and they're known as televangelists. So I don't know if these people look familiar to you, but I've definitely kind of come across them in my own, like surfing television on a Saturday morning. And they're modern day examples of evangelical preachers. So if you've seen them before, I want you guys to think of their style and kind of the way that they try to preach about religion and about God. And it's very similar in a lot of ways to evangelical preachers of the 1700s. These guys are the modern day equivalents of what you're reading about in your textbook, and these evangelical preachers who start to become popular during this movement known as the Great Awakening. So what we have to understand is a couple of things. One, who are evangelicals? And then two, what is the Great Awakening and what kind of impact is this having on, the British colonial society? So to get a little bit better idea of what evangelicals believe in, this quote I think kind of specifies it and kind of draws it out for us. So whereas the Puritans had held that assurance is rare, late, and the fruit of struggle in the experience of believers, the evangelicals believe it to be general, normally given at conversion, and the result of simple acceptance of the gift of God. So I think right there it kind of gives you an idea of a big difference between evangelicals and these earlier Protestant denominations that we've been discussing. Evangelicals believe that being saved is much easier to attain than, say, the Puritans. They don't have a concept of the elect, of predestination. It's a much more open and accepting religion. Now, let's get into some specifics. What is evangelical Christianity? Because when you associate the Great Awakening, you want to associate the Great Awakening with evangelicalism, which is another denomination of Christianity. So denomination means another type of Christianity. And remember when we talked, Protestant Christianity breaks up into a lot of different denominations. So far in our class, we've talked about the Puritans, we've talked about the Quakers, we've talked about the Anglicans, and now we're adding in evangelicals, the different type of Protestantism. And this is still popular in certain parts of the country of America today, in the South, the Midwest, but it kind of gets its origins here in colonial America. So we have to kind of see their beliefs. And in your head, what I want you guys to do as we go through the beliefs of the evangelicals is to try and compare them to Puritans or to Quakers, the different religious groups that we've studied. I think Puritans are probably the best comparison to try to make. So first thing that evangelicals believe in is something called being born again. So you may have heard people in our modern society say that they're a born-again Christian. This idea comes from evangelicalism. Okay, and being born again, what this means is that they may have been a different type of Christianity. They may have been Puritan. They may have been Anglican. But when they kind of realize that their path, they're going down the wrong path, and they decide to convert to evangelicalism, where they find God once again, that's considered being born again. And it's almost like to evangelicals like a second baptism, like a second start at life, a renewal of your faith. Okay, so evangelicals believe that you can be born again, that you can kind of refresh your soul and you can kind of atone for your sins, and you can still kind of be saved. Even if you were a sinner for the first 30 years of your life, you can kind of atone for that and be born again and kind of find true religion again. So different than the Puritans. And the Puritans, if you kind of led that sinful life, um, you really don't really have a chance to atone for your sins. But it's a different mentality with evangelical Christianity. Another big thing is that they're going to identify very strongly with the biblical story. So if you go back to our televangelists, if you ever watch them on TV, they're always kind of telling stories from the Bible and using stories to try and like connect it to modern day life and to people's everyday life. And so they're going to kind of really identify with the stories within the Bible and try and use those as ways to connect with people in general and to connect with their lives. Next big thing, which is huge, is they reject this whole idea of predetermination. They reject this whole idea of there being an elect, a select group of people that are going to go to heaven. Evangelicals believe that anybody can attain salvation. Anybody can attain, getting to heaven. It's not a selective group. All you have to do is be able to truly believe in the Word of God and be born again, and you can achieve, salvation. Now, this is a big difference, another big difference between evangelicals and pretty much all the other Protestant denominations we've talked about, and Catholicism for that matter. Evangelicals really are going to emphasize being emotional in their preaching style. So when we're talking about evangelical preachers, they're going to really try to elicit emotion out of people and really get them to feel what's happening in the Bible and feel kind of whether it's fear or happiness. They try to get people excited about religion and get people interested in religion. So they really emphasize emotion in the way that they preach. Now, what really starts to happen here is kind of interesting. You have kind of the superstar of the Great Awakening is this man right here. His name is George Whitefield. So he's actually from England. He's a preacher in England, and the Great Awakening actually begins in England and then travels to the United States. So he preaches in England in like the 1720s, 1730s, 1740s, and he kind of goes tours up and down England, preaching and kind of giving his unique brand of Christianity. Then he comes to the British colonies. So when he comes to the British colonies, he's going to kind of pioneer a type of preaching style that's pretty unique at the time. So what you're looking at here is called an outdoor revival meeting. And they still kind of have similar things to this today in America. It was popular in the 1700s. There's going to be another wave of this called the Second Great Awakening in the 1800s. But what basically I guess the best way to describe it is you kind of have people coming from, let's say, like all the surrounding towns, all the surrounding villages, the surrounding countryside, and they would set up kind of in the middle of, either the back country or the outskirts of town, or, kind of like an outdoor facility, and they'd set up these makeshift places for them to preach. And it was kind of an event that people would go to, and they would go and they would listen to these people speak, and George Whitefield would be like the main speaker at these major events. And I think a lot of people now will be surprised to kind of hear how popular these things were and how people kind of anticipated going to these different outdoor revival meetings. It's kind of like a picnic / rock concert / religious festival is really what it is. I kind of consider them like religious rock festivals is really what it is. And the main attraction is a speaker, which for Americans now is strange to hear. It's somebody, they're interested in listening to somebody speak about God for 5, 6, 7 hours. And to them that's entertaining. To them that's interesting. They want to kind of engage in that dialogue. So it's a different kind of mentality from our time period to their time period. But people are going to come. One of the documents you're going to read is talking about Benjamin Franklin and how he's talking to local people and how interested they are in coming to listen to George Whitefield preach and listen to the message that he's kind of bringing out. Now, Whitefield's going to kind of tour up and down the colonies. He goes from the middle colonies to the New England colonies to the southern colonies, all up and down the colonies to the back country. They even preach to slaves, and the message kind of gets out there to slaves. So he's going all the way throughout the colony. So in certain ways, it's kind of the same message is going to all the different British colonies. Now, another famous preacher from the time period is a guy named Jonathan Edwards, and he gives a famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And this is a type of preaching that becomes popular during the Great Awakening, which is called fire and brimstone preaching, which is trying to elicit fear of the punishment of God, fear of hell, to try and get people to live a better, more pure life. So I'm actually going to put up a video of a reenactment of somebody kind of giving his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So you guys can kind of watch it and just kind of get an idea of what it was all about, kind of get some ideas of what this type style of preaching was really all about. Now, the other big movement that's happening really at the same time, again, a movement that begins in Europe, but also spreads to the British colonies. Because remember, the British colonies are connected to European society. These things that happen in Europe kind of flow into the Americas. Things that happen to the Americas kind of flow into European society. It's not just products that are being exchanged. It's ideas, it's beliefs, it's religious movements, it's things like the Enlightenment. So I know you guys learned about this in global history. The Enlightenment is also known as the Age of Reason. And it's where people start to kind of question their societies and try to find practical solutions to social, political problems that they face in their societies. And a big part of what the Enlightenment philosophers focus on is reforming government and trying to find out what is the best form of government for people, for society, for government officials, in order for society to function at its best. Okay, so this is something that's grown out of the scientific revolution, the Renaissance, this kind of thinking that's been going on in Europe throughout the 1500s, 1600s, and into the 1700s. So it's the political aspect of that. Now, some famous Enlightenment philosophers that are going to come up in our class later that really influence both Europe and influence American ideology. Some real famous ones are John Locke, who you guys have probably learned about in the past. He's going to have a huge influence on our Declaration of Independence. Baron de Montesquieu, he writes a famous book called In the Spirit of Laws, and he has a huge impact on our Constitution, on this whole idea of separation of power in the Constitution. Voltaire is a huge advocate for freedom of religion, among other rights that he advocates for. Beccaria, he's a big kind of advocate for rights of the accused and kind of rights for those people who are going to be put on trial. So a lot of these things kind of find themselves into American thought at the time. Now, Americans also have their own distinct colonial origins for why they believe in separation of power, or life, liberty, and property, and these different rights that the Enlightenment philosophers are all talking about what are God-given rights to people. But they're also influenced by the movement. Now, what you want to think about in comparison to the Great Awakening, which segments of colonial society are most impacted by this? Are most impacted by the Enlightenment, and which segments of colonial society are most impacted by the Great Awakening? This, for the most part, is going to impact what I would call our intelligentsia, which is like our intellectual class within American society. People who are well educated, and we have a distinct group of people who are well educated in American society. So they're going to be reading these philosophers, they're going to be reading these books, they're interested in these things. And it's going to have an impact on the way that our country develops, the way that they view government, the way that they view rights of the people. Now, when you look at the Great Awakening, that's going to appeal more to the masses of Americans. Americans, or British colonists at the time, are interested in religion. As we know, religion has played a big part in their early ideology, their early formation. And so they're appealing to different segments of society. And those people who are interested in the Enlightenment, they understand the interest in the Great Awakening, but they're not necessarily sharing in that interest in the Great Awakening. They have different philosophies about God. A lot of the people who are interested in the Enlightenment believe in something called Diesm, which is that God plays no active role in your life. That God was they kind of the idea that they use, they say God is kind of like a clockmaker, that he created the world, kind of like set the clock, and then walked away. And they don't that God doesn't play an active role in what happens to you and what doesn't happen to you, which goes directly against the ideas of Christianity and the idea that there is a very active God, and you should pray to God to kind of atone for your sins and to try and improve your life and be thankful for God. It's kind of a different philosophy, and a lot of Enlightenment philosophers are going to believe in this. Now, who's a part of the American Enlightenment? These are names and people that you've heard before: Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. These are the American Enlightenment writers, the American Enlightenment philosophers, and they're directly influenced, like I said, from the Europeans. Now, what we're going to do on Wednesday in class is we're going to really kind of analyze the Great Awakening and a little bit of the Enlightenment as well, and kind of how it influences different parts of the colonies and how it influences the future of the colonies. So we're not really going to talk about this question, the impact of the Great Awakening. What we're going to try and do is really dive into this through our structured academic controversy debate, which I think should be a lot of fun, which we're going to try on Wednesday. So really that's your focus. What you want to think about is, what are the effects of the Great Awakening? Does it bring people together? Does it divide people? How is it kind of working within American society? Because one of the big things that the Great Awakening does is it's going to create a lot of different denominations in America. Evangelicals are not just one denomination. They break off into lots of different denominations. And I think that's an important aspect to kind of understand as far as the Great Awakening is concerned. Now, we can talk about positive and negative repercussions of that, but that's really going to be our focus on Wednesday. Our focus is going to be what is the impact of the Great Awakening? How does it affect American society? Okay? So we're going to leave it there for now. I'll see you guys on Wednesday.